Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of State Capitalism in Russia by Tony Cliff. The sections of this chapter are Marx and Engels on the nature of a worker state, the Russian army, the Soviets, elections, the party, withering away of state and law. And here we go. In the last chapter, the main facts of the social and economic relations in Russia were described. In this chapter, we shall deal with the political aspects, the state and the party. Marx and Engels, new section, Marx and Engels on the nature of a worker state. Marx and Engels used the term rather ominous sounding and widely misunderstood term. Marx and Engels used that rather ominous sounding and widely misunderstood term, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, to denote the content, not the form, of the state which would replace the capitalist state. That is to say, to define the ruling class. To them, in this context, dictatorship simply meant class rule, and therefore the Athenian city-state, the Roman Empire, Napoleon's rule, British parliamentary government, Bismarck's Germany, and the Paris Commune were all dictatorships because, in all of them, a class or number of classes were under the rule of another class. In Marx and Engels' writings, the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat is conceived of as a very full democracy. For instance, in the Communist Manifesto, it is stated that, quote, the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy, end quote. More than 40 years later, Engels wrote, quote, if one thing is certain is that our party and the working class can only come to power under the form of the democratic republic. This is even the specific form for the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the Great French Revolution has shown, end quote. I believe that Great French Revolution that was being referred to is the Paris Commune, not to the 1979 revolution. I mean the 1793 revolution, or 1789 revolution, excuse me. Back to the text. The ideas of Marx and Engels regarding the democratic form of the dictatorship of the proletariat were realized in the Paris Commune of 1871. Engels wrote, quote, look at the Paris Commune, that was the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. And Marx pointed out that, quote, the first decree of the Commune was the suppression of the standing army and the substitution of the standing army for the armed people, end quote. And then, quote, the Commune was formed of the municipal councillors chosen by universal suffrage in various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at short terms. The majority of its members were naturally working men or acknowledged representatives of the working class, ... Instead of continuing to be the agent of the central government, the police were at once stripped of their political attributes and turned into the responsible and at all times revocable agents of the Commune. So were the officials of all other branches of the administration. From the members of the Commune downward, public service had to be done at workmen's wages. The vested interests and the representation allowances of the high dignitaries of state disappeared along with the high dignitaries themselves. The judicial functionaries were to be divested of sham independence. Like the rest of the public servants, magistrates and judges were to be elective, responsible, and revocable, end quote. Marx. To quote Engels once more, quote, against this transformation of the state and the organs of the state from servants of society into the masters of society, a process which had been inevitable in all previous states, the Commune made use of two infallible expedients. In the first place, the Commune filled all posts, administrative, judicial, and educational, by election on the basis of universal suffrage of all concerned, with the right of these electors to recall their delegate at any time. And in the second place, all officials, high or low, were paid only the wages received by other workers. The highest salary paid by the Commune to anyone was 6,000 francs. In this way, an effective barrier to place hunting and careerism was set up, even apart from the imperative mandate to delegated... Even apart from the imperative mandated to delegated... imperative mandate to do... Oh no, there's a fucking typo here. God damn it. In this way, an effective barrier to place hunting and careerism was set up, even apart from the imperative mandated to delegates to representative bodies which were added in profusion, end quote. That's my best guess of correcting the typo. Marx declared that with its universal suffrage, the right of recall of every civil servant, workmen's wages for all officials, maximum local self-government, and the absence of armed forces elevated above the people and oppressing the people, the Paris Commune constituted workers' democracy. The antithesis of the worker state was the monstrous bureaucracy and the army of the capitalist states, which in Engels' words, quote, threatened to devour the whole of society, end quote, Engels. That's from The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. This briefly is Marx and Engels' conception of a worker state, a consistent extreme democracy. This is the conception let us now counterpose the reality of the Russian state. To this conception, let us now counterpose the reality of the Russian Stalinist state. New section, the Russian army. The main factor in the state is the armed forces. To use Lenin's formulation, the state, quote, consists of special bodies of armed men which have prisons, etc. at their disposal, end quote. Lenin. That's from The State and Revolution. Therefore, the starting point of any analysis of the present Russian state apparatus, especially from the standpoint of Marxism, must be the structure of the armed forces. As Trotsky so aptly wrote, quote, the army is a copy of society and suffers from all the society's diseases, usually at a higher temperature, end quote. Trotsky. That's from The Revolution Betrayed. The formation of a people's militia was traditionally demanded by socialist parties. Footnote. See, for instance, Article 12 of the 1903 program of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. End footnote. Accordingly, one of the first acts of the Bolshevik leaders on taking power was to issue a decree which included the following clauses. 2. Full power within any army unit and combination of units is to be in the hands of the soldiers' committees and Soviets. 4. The elective principle for army commanders is hereby introduced. All commanders up to the regimental commander are to be elected by a general vote of the different units, Commanders higher than regimental commanders, including the commander-in-chief, are to be elected by a congress, of committees of the army units, for which the commander is being elected, Next day, a further decree added, in quote, in full fulfillment of the will of the revolutionary people, which is concerned with the immediate and decisive eradication of every inequality, the Council of People's Commissars hereby decrees, 1. To abolish all ranks and title from the rank of corporal to that of general, 2. To abolish all privileges and the external marks formerly connected with the different ranks and titles. 3. To abolish all saluting. 4. To abolish all decorations and other signs of distinction. 5. To abolish all officers' organizations. 6. To abolish the institution of batmen in the army. End quote. But the Bolsheviks' desire for a real democratization of the army, for its transformation into a people's militia, met with disaster on the rocks of objective reality. In the early days after the October Revolution, the revolutionary armed forces consisted of small groups of volunteers. The masses of the people were sick and tired of war and were not ready to volunteer for the new revolutionary armed forces. In order to meet the challenge of the white armies, which were backed by powerful foreign powers, the Bolsheviks were forced to replace voluntary principle by conscription. In addition, lacking experienced commanders, they were forced to recruit tens of thousands of officers of the former Tsarist army. This clearly made it necessary to abandon the elective principle in the choice of army commanders. One could hardly expect the peasants and workers in uniform to elect to their command those officers whom they so hated as representatives of the old regime. The needs of battle also made it imperative to abandon the ideal of an army built on a territorial basis of arming the people and to return to the barracks. The Bolshevik leaders never denied for a moment that these measures constitute a deviation from the socialist program. See, for instance, the resolution of the Eighth Party Congress, March 1919. Moreover, they strongly oppose any attempt to render them permanent. Thus, for instance, when a former general of the Tsarist army who fought with the Bolsheviks during the Civil War stated that the army of a socialist country should not be based on militia, but on the old established barrack system, the People's Commissar of War, Trotsky sternly replied, quote, the Communist Party did not come to power in order to replace the tricolor barracks by red ones, end quote. The Bolsheviks frequently reiterated their intention to introduce the militia system as early as possible. Thus, for instance, at the 7th Congress of the Soviets, held in December 1919, Trotsky declared, quote, "It is necessary to begin a transition to the realization of the militia system of arming the Soviet Republic," end quote. Trotsky. That's from How the Revolution Armed Itself by Trotsky. The same idea again is put forward in a thesis published by Trotsky on the 16th of December 1919. One second. The Ninth Party Congress decided to concretize this intention by building units of workers' militia side by side with the regular army, and it was hoped to develop these gradually until they should replace the latter entirely. But this resolution was never carried out. Any plan to introduce a people's militia was inhibited by objective realities. Russia's backward productive forces, the low cultural level of the people, the fact that the proletariat was a small minority of the population. This is explained clearly by I. Smilga, a leading Bolshevik in the army, who said in 1921, quote, "The militia system, whose basic characteristic is the territorial principle, is faced with an unsurpassable political obstacle in the path of its introduction in Russia. Given the numerically weak proletariat in Russia, we are not able to ensure proletarian guidance in the territorial militia units, ... Even greater difficulties in the path of the introduction of the militia system arise from the viewpoint of strategy. With the weakness of our railroad system, we should not be able, in the case of war, to concentrate forces in the threatened directions, ... Therefore, the experience of the Civil War was incontrovertibly shown that has incontrovertibly shown that territorial formations were entirely unsuitable. The soldiers deserting and not wishing to leave their villages during offensive was as well as retreat. Therefore, the return to this form of organization would be a crude, wholly unjustifiable error," end quote. Trotsky. No, who's that? No, not Trotsky. Smilga. The backwardness of the productive forces and connected with it the peasant nature of the country were the two decisive factors in making the Red Army a regular army and not a militia, although many elements of democracy and equalitarianism not normally associated with regular armed forces were built into the structure of the Red Army. The economic level of a given country is, after all, the decisive historical factor. As Marx said, quote, "Our theory that the organization of labor is conditioned by the means of production is, it seems, nowhere as brilliantly corroborated as in the, quote, human slaughter industry," end quote, end quote. That's quoted in the Soviet Military Encyclopedia. I don't know. The material and cultural backwardness of Russia revealed itself also in the relations between soldiers and officers. From the beginning, the Bolsheviks found it an unavoidable necessity to appoint ex-czarist officers, notwithstanding their previous agitation for the substitution of all appointed officers by those elected by the officers. I believe, I'm not exactly sure, I wrote a historiography of, obviously I didn't read all the books, I just, could just cipher through what I could guess was their, sift through what I guess was their general intention. But one of the books that was a biography of Trotsky said that Trotsky was responsible for convincing Lenin of this necessity of appointing ex-czarist officers. I just wanted to look it up real quick. Ivar Smilga, who lived from 1892 to 1938, was a Latvian Bolshevik leader, Soviet politician, and economist. He was a member of the left opposition in the Soviet Union. Where am I? I'm not sure where I left off, but I'll just reread from... I'll probably reread something. From the beginning, the Bolsheviks found it unavoidably an unavoidable necessity to appoint ex-czarist officers, notwithstanding their previous agitation for the substitution of all appointed officers by those elected by the officers. It was impossible to wage the war against the white armies without tried commanders, and if the choice were left to the officers, they would not have elected ex-czarist officers. From the beginning, there was a struggle between the political commissars on the one hand and the party collective in the army on the other. This conflict converged with another being centralist and decentralist tendencies. Out of these two struggles, the political commissars emerged victorious over the party collectives, and the center overcame the guerrilla tendencies. The convergence of these two struggles reflected a strengthening bureaucratic tendency in the army. It was not long before the ex-czarist officers began to influence the new commanders of proletariat origin. The Bolshevik Petrovsky stated, quote, "Within the walls of the military school, we encountered the old regime view of the peasant about the role of the officer with respect to the mass of the private soldiers. We had also noticed a certain trend to the upper-class traditions of the cadets of the Tsarist military schools, ... Professionalism is the scourge which lashed morally officers. Professionalism and the scourge which lashed morally Professionalism is the scourge. It's a fucking another typo. Professionalism and the scourge which lashed morally officers of all times and in all circumstances." I'm saying professionalism is the scourge. They, bracket, the Red Army commanders, end bracket, became members of the new officers' groups, and no agitation whatsoever, nor beautiful speeches about the necessity of contact with the masses would be of any avail. The conditions of existence are stronger than kind wishes. End quote. It's quoted from a book by D.F. White, The Growth of the Red Army. Wikipedia says Grigory Petrovsky was a Ukrainian Soviet politician and old Bolshevik. Grigory Petrovsky participated in the signing of the Treaty on the Creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Grigory Petrovsky was Communist Party leader in Ukraine until 1938 and one of the officials responsible for implementing Stalin's policy of collectivization. Back to the text. The commanders, the political commissars, and others with authority in the Red Army began to use their positions to gain advantage for themselves. Trotsky took them severely to task for this, such as on the occasion, the 31st of October 1920, when Trotsky wrote to the revolutionary military councils of fronts and armies condemning the use of government cars by those in authority for, quote, gay parties right before the eyes of the tired Red Army soldiers, end quote. Trotsky spoke angrily of, quote, commanders who, dress with extreme elegance while fighters go half naked, end quote, attacked the drinking bouts indulged in by commanders and political commissars. And Trotsky concluded, quote, such facts cannot but provoke exasperation and discontent among the Red Army soldiers, end quote. In the same letter, Trotsky expounds his aim, quote, without setting the impossible goal of immediate elimination of all and sundry privileges in the army, to endeavor to reduce these systematically to the actual necessary minimum, end quote. Trotsky. That's from Trotsky, How the Revolution Armed Itself, Volume 2, Book 1. Trotsky's realistic revolutionary conception clearly reveals the immense difficulties of the situation. In spite of these abuses, however, the existence of the Bolshevik Party, with cells throughout the army, together with the revolutionary enthusiasm and self-sacrifice of the common soldier and the presence of Trotsky at its head, ensured the maintenance of the proletarian character of the Red Army during the Civil War. With the partial victory of the bureaucracy in 1923, arrogance and a dictatorial attitude towards their troops became the rule among the officers rather than the exception. The key positions in the party cells within the army were gradually taken over by the commanders themselves until in 1926 it was noted by the political department of the army that 2/3 of all positions in the party apparatus in the army were in the hands of commanders. In other words, the officers became the political leaders who were supposed to defend the soldiers against the officers. Even so, this was still not a completely independent officer caste. For one thing, the living conditions of the commanders were hard and not very difficult from those of the not very different from those of the soldiers. According to White, quote, in 1925, only 30% of the commanding personnel were housed in a manner regarded by Frunze, People's Commissar of War, at all as tolerable. "70% had housing facilities below that level." Frunze spoke of various localities where several commanders with their families had only one room among them. In other words, each family had only part of a room at its disposal. The reserve commanders, when called for retraining outside the ranks of the army, were remunerated for the work on a basis which could not look attractive to a Chinese coolie. Those employed or belonging to the peasantry were paid 5 kopecks per hour, which the unemployed among them were paid 9 kopecks an hour for the time they were engaged in their studies. End quote. Wait. Wikipedia says Mikhail Frunze, who lived from 1885 to 1925, was a Soviet revolutionary politician, army officer, and military theorist. Born to a Bessarabian father and a Russian mother in Russian Turkestan, Mikhail Frunze attended the St. Petersburg Polytechnical University and became an active member of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Following the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party ideological split, Mikhail Frunze sided with Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction. Mikhail Frunze led the textile workers' strike in Ivanovo during the 1905 Russian Revolution, for which he was later sentenced to death before being commuted to lifelong hard labor in Siberia. Mikhail Frunze escaped 10 years later and took active part in the 1917 February Revolution in Minsk and the October Revolution in Moscow. Mikhail Frunze distinguished himself as one of the most successful Red Army commanders during the Russian Civil War, achieving major victories over the White Army of Peter Wrangel in Crimea and Nestor Makhno's anarchist movement in Ukraine. In 1921, Mikhail Frunze was elected to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. In 1925, Mikhail Frunze was named chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council. Mikhail Frunze's health failing due to chronic ulcer surgery. Frunze died in 1925 during surgery related to chloroform poisoning, in which the surgery had been arranged by Joseph Stalin, and received a burial in the Kremlin Wall necropolis. The capital of the Kyrgyz SSR and his birthplace, Pishpek, modern Bishkek, was renamed after him from 1926 until 1991. The Frunze Military Academy, one of the most prestigious military educational institutions in the Soviet Union, was also named in his honor. Wollenberg, who is himself a commander in the Red Army, gives these facts. Quote, in 1924, the pay of a corps commander was 150 rubles a month, corresponding roughly to that earned by a well-paid metal worker. It was thus 25 rubles a month below the, quote, party maximum, end quote, i.e. the largest monthly salary that a party member was allowed to accept in those days. ... There were at that time no special officers' mess. The meals of officers and men were prepared in the same kitchens. Communist officers seldom wore the badges of their rank and went off duty, and frequently dispensed with them even when on duty. At that time, the Red Army acknowledged a relationship of superior and subordinate only during the performance of a military duty. In any case, every soldier knew his commanding officer, with or without badges or of rank. Officers' servants were abolished, end quote. Wallenberg. Erich Wollenberg lived from 1892 to 1973 and was until 1933 a leading member of the Communist Party of Germany, and in later years an independent journalist and publicist. Furthermore, soldiers were allowed to and did, in fact, complain about their officers to the military prosecutor's office. There were on average 1,892 complaints per month during 1925, 1,923 monthly during 1926, 2,082 monthly during 1927, until 1931 to 33, quote, natural and easy relations between officers and men, end quote, existed. White reveals that White puts the turning point to the consolidation of the officer caste a little earlier, the Army Statutes of 1928, which White describes as, quote, the real dividing line, end quote, and what followed as, quote, the development of a trend already well established, end quote. White. By these statutes, a life career was open to Army officers, and White described them with ample justification as the, quote, Magna Carta of the commanding personnel, end quote, as, quote, something closely akin to the Patrine Table of Ranks, end quote. What else am I looking at? Sorry, I'm looking for some of these keywords here that I don't understand. Wikipedia says the table of ranks. It doesn't say Patrine Table of Ranks. But it says Table of Ranks. According to Wikipedia, the Table of Ranks was a formal list of positions and ranks in the military, government, and court of Imperial Russia. Peter the Great introduced the system in 1722 while engaging in a struggle with the existing hereditary nobility, or boyars. The Table of Ranks was formally abolished on the 11th of November 1917 by the newly established Bolshevik government. During the Vladimir Putin presidency, a similar formalized structure has been reintroduced in many governmental departments, combined with formal uniforms and insignia, local government, diplomatic service, prosecution service, investigative committee. Back to the text. In 1929, the, quote, gradual transformation of Red Army houses into officers' clubs, end quote, began. Although the soldiers' pay remained very low, officers' salaries began to rise, as the following table shows. It says a platoon commander's monthly allowances increased 240% between 1934 and 1939. Company commanders' monthly allowance increased 263% between 1934 and 1939. The battalion commanders' monthly allowances increased 254% between 1934 and 1939. The regimental commanders' monthly allowances increased 300% between 1934 and 1939. Divisional commanders' monthly allowances increased 377% between 1934 and 1939. And the corps commanders' monthly allowances increased 364% between 1934 and 1939. It has been estimated that in 1937, the average annual pay of privates and non-commissioned officers taken together amounted to 150 rubles, and of officers to 8,000 rubles. During the Second World War, privates in the Soviet Army received an allowance of 10 rubles a month, lieutenants 1,000, and colonels 2,400. In sharp contrast to this wide differentiation, we do not quote this approvingly, but only for comparison. Privates in the United States Army received $50 a month, lieutenants $150, and colonels $330. Although the value of the ruble declines very sharply during the last declined very sharply during the last 2 or 3 decades. This has affected officers much less than civilians, for officers have been able to take advantage of the Voentorg. Can't find anything for Voentorg. An exclusive cooperative organization which runs shops, restaurants, laundries, tailoring, and boot-making establishments. Special houses with all conveniences are built for them. They and their families travel free on railways, buses, ships, etc. The ordinary soldiers get none of these advantages. The only concession made to them is free postage for their outgoing letters and for their families' letters coming to them. A decree of the 22nd of September 1935 introduced the following ranks into the Army and Air Force: Lieutenant, Senior Lieutenant, Captain, Major, Colonel, Brigadier, Commander of Division, Commander of Army Corps, Army Commander of the second rank, Army Commander of the first rank, and lastly, Marshal of the Soviet Union. Similar ranks were introduced into the Navy. Additional ones were given to the military technical services. On the 7th of May 1940, more ranks were introduced into the Army and Air Forces: Major General, Lieutenant General, Colonel General, General of the Army, and into the Navy: Rear Admiral, Vice Admiral, Admiral, Admiral of the Fleet. Finally, on the 26th of June 1945, the rank of Generalissimo of the Soviet Union was introduced. On the 3rd of September 1940, badges of rank on the old Tsarist pattern, such as gold braid epaulets and gold, platinum, and diamond star emblems worn by marshals, were restored. This was a far cry from the days of the Civil War, when the whites were dubbed, quote, gold braid epauletteurs, end quote. A volume of the small Soviet encyclopedia published in 1930 stated that epaulettes, quote, were abolished by the November 1917 revolution as symbols of class oppression in the army, end quote. In sharp contrast to this, the Red Army paper wrote in 1943, after the introduction of the epaulettes, quote, the introduction of the traditional soldiers and officers' epaulettes, emphasized and symbolized the continuity of the glory of Russian arms throughout the history of Russia, right down to our times, end quote. Fraternization between officers and soldiers was prohibited. Even reservists were divided into the same ranks as the army, and they have the right to wear their military uniforms at any time. Nowadays, quote, nowadays, end quote, wrote John Gibbons, the Daily Worker correspondent in Moscow, quote, privates and NCOs traveling in a bus, tube, or train must give up their seats to men of superior rank should they be standing, end quote. John Gibbons, the Daily Worker, was the Communist Party of Great Britain's newspaper, I believe. I don't know, I can't really find anything for him. John Gibbons, Communist, maybe that'll look. Yeah, it says John Gibbons was the representative of the British Communist Party who had been, yeah. Okay, this is, the continuity of the Daily Worker is the Morning Star, which is the definitely the most conservative not conservative, like Stalinist papers of the Communist Party the Stalinist daily newspaper in Great Britain. Wikipedia says the Morning Star is a left-wing British daily newspaper with a focus on social, political, and trade union issues, originally founded in 1930 as the Daily Worker by the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB. Ownership was transferred from the CPGB to an independent readers' cooperative, the People's Press Printing Society, in 1945 and later renamed the Morning Star in 1966. The paper describes its editorial stance as in line with Britain's Road to Socialism, the program of the Communist Party of Britain. The Daily Worker initially opposed the Second World War, and its London edition was banned in Britain between 1941 and 1942. After the Soviet Union joined the Allies, the paper enthusiastically backed the war effort. During the Cold War, the paper provided platform for critics of the U.S. and its allies. This included whistleblowers who provided evidence that the British military were allowing their forces to collect several severed heads during the Malayan emergency and exposing the mass graves of civilians killed by the South Korean government. The paper prints the mass grave of civilians killed by the South Korean government. The Morning Star prints contributions by writers from a variety of left-wing political perspectives, including Jeremy Corbyn, Virginia Woolf, Angela Davis, Billy Strachan, Len Johnson, Wilfred Burchett, Claudia Jones, Jean Ross, and Harry Pollitt. Correspondent Alan Wingington had his British passport revoked in 1954 for his reporting on massacres in the Korean War and favorable representation of North Korean prisoner of war camps. Some non-political topics covered by the paper have included art reviews, sports, gardening reviews, and cooking. So, back to text. Quote, nowadays, wrote John Gibbons, the Daily Worker correspondent in Moscow, quote, privates and NCOs traveling in a bus, tube, or train must give up their seats to men of superior rank should they be standing, end quote. In order to keep up the appearance of superior breeding, officers are not permitted to carry large parcels in the street, not to wear felt boots when visiting a theater. High officers are not allowed to travel by underground or tram car. There are special officers' messes and officers' clubs. Even on leave, an officer is not allowed to sit at a table with other ranks in public. Every officer has his permanent Batman. I don't know what that means. Special schools have been established for officers' children from kindergarten onwards. A former count and officer of the Tsar's bodyguard, Lieutenant General Alexei Ignatiev, has in effect become the director of manners and etiquette in Stalin's army. Dancing lessons are compulsory at the military college. Count Alexei Ignatiev, who lived from 1877 to 1954, was a Russian and Soviet military attaché, diplomat, lieutenant, and later a memoirist. I'm trying to see if there's any information in Alexei Ignatiev's biography that is important to what's being said here. It says, after the Russian February Revolution in 1917, Alexei Ignatiev was appointed Major General by the Provisional Government. After the October Revolution in Russia in 1917, Alexei Ignatiev put himself at the service of the newly established Soviet government. As the sole authorized person, Alexei Ignatiev refused to hand over 225 million gold francs which belonged to the Russian state and were deposited in Paris banks to the counter-revolutionary Russian government in exile. Instead, Alexei Ignatiev handed the money over to the Soviet government, which had no knowledge of the existence of these financial deposits. Ignatieff declined the offer to become a French citizen. In general, however, he remained in France in the years that followed. After diplomatic relations were established between the Soviet Union and France, Alexei Ignatieff worked in the Soviet Trade Mission in Paris. In 1935, Alexei Ignatieff returned to the Soviet Union. Alexei Ignatieff received his old rank back from the Red Army and was later promoted to lieutenant general. Alexei Ignatieff survived the purges of the armed forces of the late 30s unscathed. Alexei Ignatieff took on responsible tasks in military training and left active service in 1947. After his retirement, Alexei Ignatieff dedicated his career to literature and most famously published his book of memoirs named 50 Years of Service. It's not really saying anything that's particularly pertinent to what is being said in Cliff's piece, but it's interesting. Wikipedia for military education in the Soviet Union says, there existed an evolved system of military education in the Soviet Union that covered a wide range of ages. The Soviet armed forces had many tri-services, educational opportunities, as well as educational institutions for the Soviet ground forces, the air forces, and the Navy. The Soviet border troops, the KGB, and the internal troops also maintained service academies. Back to the text. It is doubtful whether the officers of any other army in history dispose of greater disciplinary powers than do the Russian officers. Statutes introduced on the 12th of October 1940 stated that, quote, in case of insubordination, the commander has the right to apply all measures of coercion up to and including the application of force and firearms. The commander bears no responsibility for the consequences in case he finds it necessary to apply force and firearms in order to compel an insubordinate to fulfill a command and to restore discipline and order, ... The commander who does not in such instances apply all necessary measures to fulfill an order is remitted to trial before court-martial, end quote. An article in Pravda of the same period sheds light on yet another aspect of these statutes. Quote, grievances may be introduced only personally and individually. Submissions of group grievances for others is prohibited. No more group declarations, no more joint discussions, whether concerning an order, bad food, or any other topic. All this comes under the heading of, quote, insubordination, end quote, and for it a soldier may be shot on the spot without so much as a court-martial, hearing, or investigation if a superior officer solely and personally so decides, end quote. It's funny comparing this type of ruthless military hierarchy compared with the political content of Sergei Eisenstein's The Battleship Potemkin. That's what I'm thinking about right now. Thus, the officers have developed into as clearly defined a military hierarchy as ever existed in any society in history. New section, the Soviets. Officially, the institutions in which sovereignty resides in the USSR are the Soviets, headed by the Supreme Soviet, until 1937 by the Congress of Soviets. There are numerous indications that for many years these bodies have been little else but rubber-stamping organs, real power resting elsewhere. In the early days, things were different. In 1918, for example, Congress met 5 times. Between 1919 and 1922, it met once a year, but since the intervals between meetings have lengthened considerably. In 1923, other units joined the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, RSFSR, constituting the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. The first Congress of Soviets of USSR took place in December 1922, the second in January-February 1924, the third in May 1925, and once every 2 years until 1931. The seventh Congress took place in January-February 1935, 4 years after the previous one. There has been no improvement since, although the war emergencies doubtless served as an excuse, albeit a feeble one, to postpone sessions. This Soviet, quote, parliament, end quote, sat for only 104 days in the years 1918 to 36, or less than 6 days a year. The figure for later years is even lower, and it is significant that no Congress at all was convoked during 1931 to 35, the period of the greatest and quickest transformation of Russia. Many major steps, such as the 5-year plan, collectivization, and industrialization, were decided upon without consulting the, quote, highest authority, end quote, in the land. During the period of 1917 to 36, the power of making laws was formally vested in the hands of the Congress of Soviets and its elected Central Executive Committee. Since the victory of Stalin, however, meetings of the Central Executive Committee have averaged not more than 10 days a year. Russia has traveled far since the time when the chairman of the Central Executive Committee could say, quote, "The Central Executive Committee, as the supreme organ of the Soviet Republic, ... lays down the policy ... for the Soviet of People's Commissars to carry out," end quote. As regards the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, it is not known when it is convened, nor what is discussed at its sessions. Wikipedia says, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was the collective head of state of the Russian SFSR and the permanent body of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian SFSR that was accountable to the Supreme Soviet of the Russian SFSR in its activity and, within the nominal limits prescribed by the Constitution of the Russian SFSR, performed functions of the highest state power in the Russian SFSR between 1938 and 1990. It was elected by the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to perform the Supreme Soviet's activities when it was not in session, which in practice was most of the year. Back to the text. Since the end of the 1920s, every decision made by the Congress of Soviets and afterwards by the Supreme Soviet has been carried out unanimously. Not only has no vote ever been cast against any proposal put forward, but there has never been a single abstention, nor a proposal for amendment, nor even a speech in opposition. The merely ceremonial nature of the Supreme Soviet is clearly shown up by the character of its deliberations. Thus, for instance, when the major switch in foreign policy took place from alliance with France and England to collaboration with Hitler, the Supreme Soviet decided that there was no need to discuss the problem, quote, because of the clarity and consistency of the foreign policy of the Soviet government, end quote. The annual budget is sometimes brought to the notice of the Supreme Soviet many months after its measures are already operating. Thus, for instance, the annual budget of 1952, effective from the 1st of January that year, was announced by the Minister of Finance, Zverev, only on the 6th of March 1952. The budget for 1954 was, quote, deliberated, end quote, on the 11th of April. Similarly, one finds that while the first five-year plan came into operation on the 1st of October 1928, it was approved only in April 1929. The second five-year plan came into operation on the 1st of January 1933, but was not officially approved until 22 months later, on the 17th of November 1934. The corresponding dates for the third five-year plan were the 1st of January 1939 and March 1939 for the fourth, 1st of January 1946 and March 1946, and for the fifth, 1st of January 1951 and October 1952. In the light of these facts, the following statement by the Dean of Canterbury, Dr. Hewlett Johnson, can only be called preposterous nonsense. Quote, the executive is subordinate to the Supreme Soviet, ... All sections of the executive must be ratified by the Supreme Soviet. Quote, the highest organ of the state, end quote, runs Article 30, quote, is the Supreme Soviet, end quote. The significance of the enforcement of this law will be apparent at once to those who see with alarm precisely the opposite tendency here, as, for example, when the British Cabinet takes action without consulting Parliament, without seeking immediate and speedy ratification of its action by Parliament. More significant still is the determination that the Supreme Soviet shall control the budget. Those who hold the purse strings hold the ultimate power, end quote. Hewlett Johnson. The chapter heading in which this passage occurs is entitled, The Most Democratic Constitution in the World, ! Is this the red pope or the red bishop or whatever? Wikipedia says Hewlett Johnson was an English priest of the Church of England and Christian communist. Hewlett Johnson was Dean of Manchester and later Dean of Canterbury, where Hewlett Johnson acquired his nickname, quote, the Red Dean of Canterbury, end quote, for his unyielding support towards Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union and its allies. Shit, where'd it go? Come on. Shit. Lost my goddamn space. Can you believe that? Alright. Back to where I was. New section, elections. On the eve of 1937 general elections, Stalin declared, quote, "Never before, no, really never, has the world ever seen elections so completely free and so truly democratic, exclamation point. History has recorded no other example of the kind," end quote. And one enthusiastic American supporter of Stalin's regime states, quote, "With secret balloting, without fear of favor, he, bracket the Soviet citizen, end bracket, can vote for the person or policy that he really wants," end quote. Yet in these, quote, completely free and so truly democratic, end quote, elections, there is never more than one candidate for the electors to choose in each constituency. Also, never in any single one of the hundreds of constituencies has the percentage of voters ever been less than 98%. The poll has nearly always been 99.9%, and one candidate actually polled more than 100%. It was Stalin who polled 2,122 votes in the election to the local Soviets that took place on the 21st of December 1947. Despite the fact that the constituency that, quote, elected, end quote, Stalin had only 1,617 voters. The sheer idiocy of this incident is only exceeded by the outrageous explanation offered by Pravda the next day. It reads, quote, "The extra ballot papers were put into the urns by citizens of neighboring constituencies anxious to seize the opportunity to express their gratitude to their leaders," end quote. Pravda. Usually, of course, matters are arranged with more care, and consequently, very little evidence of the gerrymandering exists. Nevertheless, there are other cases on record, such a one was the referendum in Lithuania on the 12th of July 1940 to settle the matter of the proposed amalgamation of Lithuania with the USSR. The TASS agency in Moscow. Sorry, I'm just going to copy that real quick. Was not informed that the local authorities had decided to extend the referendum over 2 days, and so Moscow announced the results after the first day of the referendum, although the votes were not actually counted till the next day. By, quote, accident, end quote, the results turned out to be exactly as forecast. Quote, "It was an unfortunate slip by which a London newspaper published the official results from a Russian news agency 24 hours before the polls were officially closed," end quote. I don't know what TASS agency, but it looks like it might be a news agency. From, I don't know. Wikipedia says the Russian news agency TASS, abbreviated TASS, TACC, is a Russian state-owned news agency founded in 1904. TASS is the largest Russian news agency and one of the world's largest news agencies worldwide. TASS is registered as a federal state unitary enterprise owned by the government of Russia. Headquartered in Moscow, TASS has 70 offices in Russia and in the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, quote, along with 56 global branches in 53 countries, end quote. In Soviet times, it was named the Telegraph Agency of the Soviet Union, and was the central agency for news collection and distribution for all Soviet newspapers, radio, and television stations. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, TASS was renamed Information Telegraph Agency of Russia in 1992, but regained the simpler TASS name in 2014. Currently, on a daily basis, TASS is, quote, publishing nearly 3,000 news items in 6 languages around the world. In 6 languages, and about 700 photographs and videos from correspondents in Russia and across the world, end quote. Back to the text. The election regulations stipulated that any interference with the electoral rights of citizens will be punished. Yet, for example, between the nomination of candidates and the actual results of the Supreme Soviet in December 1937, 37 candidates, among them 2 members of the Politburo, the Political Bureau, Kassior and Chubar, disappeared and were replaced by others. No explanation was offered to the electors, and no one, it would seem, considered it healthy to inquire into the matter. 15 days before the same elections, the Moscow correspondent of the New York Times cabled to his paper a forecast as to the composition and personnel of the next Supreme Soviet. He stated that it would consist of 246 high party officials, 365 civil and military officials, 78 representatives of the intelligentsia, 131 workmen, and 223 kolkhoz members, and give their names. Except for the 37 arrested at the last minute, his forecast exactly corresponded to the results in every detail. How could that conceivably happen in any election that was not rigged? New section, the party. Since the Communist Party of the Soviet Union is a state party, analysis of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's structure, composition, and functioning must also be an analysis of the state machine. Before analyzing the working of the party from the time Stalin came to the helm, it is important to counterpose to the party's present monolithic and totalitarian character the actual democratic of the working of the party in the period prior to the rise of the bureaucracy. The Bolshevik had never been a monolithic and totalitarian party. Far from it. Internal democracy had always been of the utmost importance in party life, but for one reason or another this factor has been glossed over in most of the literature dealing with the subject. It will therefore be worthwhile to digress somewhat and devote some space to setting out a number of cases which illustrate inter-party democracy in the pre-Stalinist years. We shall begin with a few examples from the period prior to the October Revolution. In 1907, after the final defeat of the revolution, the party suffered a crisis over the question of what attitude to take to the elections to the Tsarist Duma. At the third conference of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, held in July 1907, in which Bolsheviks as well as Mensheviks were represented, a curious situation arose. All the Bolshevik delegates, with the sole exception of Lenin, voted in favor of boycotting the elections to the Duma. Lenin voted with the Mensheviks. 3 years later, a plenum of the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks passed a resolution calling for unity with the Mensheviks. Again, the only dissident voice was Lenin's. When the 1914-18 war broke out, not one of the party's branches adopted the revolutionary defeatist position which Lenin advocated, and at a trial of some Bolshevik leaders in 1915, Kamenev and 2 Bolshevik Duma delegates repudiated Lenin's revolutionary defeatist position. The problem with, I think there's a problem. I think this is how Draper has a piece about this, but there's a problem with revolutionary defeatism in terms of its usually means victories for the opposing states, right? So, revolutionary defeatism, in some sense, if you were to say French, was de facto revolutionary endorsement of France's enemies, right? So there's a problem there. What was I going to say? When the 1914 to 18 war broke out, not one of the party's branches adopted the revolutionary defeatist position which Lenin advocated. And at a trial of some Bolshevik leaders in 1915, Kamenev and 2 Bolshevik Duma delegates repudiated Lenin's revolutionary defeatist position. After the February Revolution, one finds the large majority of the party leaders were not for a revolutionary Soviet government, but for support of the coalition provisional government. The Bolshevik faction had 40 members of the Petrograd Soviet on the 2nd of March 1917, but when the resolution to transfer power to the bourgeois coalition government was put to vote, only 19 voted against. At a meeting of the Petrograd Committee of the party on the 5th of March 1917, a resolution for a revolutionary Soviet government received only 1 vote. Pravda, edited by Stalin at the time, had a position which can in no way be called revolutionary. It decisively declared its support for the provisional government, quote, insofar as it struggles against reaction or counter-revolution, end quote. That's from Pravda, 1917. Published in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. Again, when Lenin came to Russia on the 3rd of April 1917 and issued his famous April Theses, alike guiding the party to the October Revolution, Lenin was, for a time, in a small minority in his own party. Pravda's comment on the April theses was that it was, quote, Lenin's personal opinion, end quote, and, quote, quite unacceptable, end quote. At a meeting of the Petrograd Committee of the party held on the 8th of April 1917, the theses received only 2 votes, while 13 voted against it and 1 abstained. However, at the conference of the party held 14th to the 22nd of April, the theses gained a majority, 71 for, 39 against, and 8 abstentions. The same conference defeated Lenin on another important question, viz. Whether the party should participate in the proposed Stockholm Conference of the Socialist Parties. Against his views, it decided in favor of full participation. Again, on the 14th of September, Kerensky convened a, quote, democratic conference, end quote, and Lenin spoke strongly in favor of boycotting it. The Central Committee decided by 9 votes to 8 to boycott it, but as the vote was so nearly equal, the final decision was left to the party conference, which was to be constituted out of the Bolshevik faction in the, quote, democratic conference, end quote. This meeting decided by 77 votes to 50 not to boycott it. When the most important question of all, the question of the October insurrection, was on the order of the day, the leadership again was found to be sharply divided. A strong faction led by Zinoviev, Kamenev, Rykov, Pyatakov, Miliutin, and Nagin opposed the uprising. Nevertheless, when the Politburo was elected by the Central Committee, neither Zinoviev nor Kamenev were excluded. After taking power, the differences in the party leadership continued to be as sharp as before. A few days after the revolution, a number of party leaders came out with a demand for a coalition with other socialist parties. Those insisting on including Rykov and the People's Commissar of the Interior, Miliutin, the People's Commissar of Agriculture, Nagin, the People's Commissar of Industry and Trade, Lunacharsky, the People's Commissar of Education, Shliapnikov, the People's Commissar of Labor, Kamenev, the President of the Republic, and Zinoviev. They went as far as resigning from the government, this compelling Lenin and his superiors to open negotiations with the other parties. The negotiations broke down because the Mensheviks insisted on the exclusion of Lenin and Trotsky from this coalition government. Again, on the question of holding or postponing the elections to the Constituent Assembly in December 1917, Lenin found himself in a minority in the Central Committee, and against his advice the elections were held. A little later, Lenin was again defeated on the question of the peace negotiation with Germany at Brest-Litovsk. He was for an immediate peace, but at a meeting of the Central Committee and active workers held on the 21st of January 1918, Lenin's motion received only 15 votes against Bukharin's motion for, quote, revolutionary war, end quote, which received 32 votes, and Trotsky's for, quote, neither peace nor war, end quote, which received 16. At a session of the Central Committee next day, Lenin was again defeated, but at last he succeeded under the pressure of events in convincing the majority of members of the Central Committee of his point of view, and at its session on the 24th of January, his motion for peace gained 7 votes, while 4 voted against and another 4 abstained. The atmosphere of monolithism, which has been imputed so assiduously to the Bolshevik Party both before and immediately after the revolution, lifts when faced with the facts. This atmosphere, however, became a reality later. For a long time, the most important body in the party was the Congress. Lenin, for instance, declared, quote, the Congress is the most responsible assembly of the party in the Republic, end quote. But with the rise of power of the bureaucracy, it progressively lost its importance. The 1919, 1922, and 1925 party rules, Rules 20, 20, 21, respectively, stipulated that Congresses were to be held annually until the 14th Congress. In 1925, this was adhered to. But after that, they were held more and more infrequently. The next Congress took place 2 years later. Between that one and the 16th Congress in 1930, 2.5 years elapsed, and between the 16th and 17th in 1934, 3.5 years. This latter Congress promulgated new rules by which Congress was to be convened, quote, not less than once in 3 years, end quote. Rule 27. But even this was not observed. 5 years elapsed between the 17th and 18th Congress, 1939, and then, between the 18th and 19th Congress, 1952, there was a long gap of over 13 years. According to the party rules, the Central Committee must convene party conferences between the Congresses, and under the regulations adopted at the 18th Congress and still officially enforced, these must be held, quote, not less than once a year, end quote. Since 1919, conferences have been held in 1919, 1920, 1921 twice, 1923, 1924, 1925, 1926, 1929, 1932, 1934, and most recently in 1941. The Congress elected the Central Committee, the leading body of the party. Formally, the Central Committee is accountable to the party Congress, but when the latter is not convened for more than 13 years, this provision can hardly be other than a dead letter. Formally, the Central Committee elects the Political Bureau, and therefore the latter should be accountable to the former. In actual fact, however, the Central Committee is entirely subordinate to the Political Bureau. If the Central Committee really exercised supreme authority in the party, the Central Committee would have been impossible for a majority, over 3/4 in fact, of its members to have been expelled and persecuted as, quote, enemies of the people, end quote, as happened between the 17th and 18th Congresses. Only 16 out of the 71 members of the Central Committee elected in 1934 reappeared in the list of Central Committee members elected 5 years later. And of the 68 candidate members, only 8 reappeared in the list. The Political Bureau, which is 13 or 14 members, selects the Secretariat, the head of which is the General Secretary. For 30 years, this post has been held by Stalin. Since the death of Stalin, the administrative setup has been more complicated. Although, to all appearances, Georgy M. Malenkov is Stalin's heir, the job of General Secretary was given to someone else, Nikita S. Khrushchev. It is now clear that Khrushchev has the upper hand. The predominance of the bureaucracy is illustrated by the fact that the General Secretary, who was, originally, merely an executor of the will of the Central Committee, is under Stalin's rule omnipotent, wielding power, greater power than any Tsar dared dreamed of. Lenin, for example, was never a member of the party's secretariat. In Lenin's day, it never included the most celebrated members of the party. For instance, immediately before Stalin's inclusion in 1922, the secretariat was composed of Molotov, Yaroslavsky, and Mikhailov, none of whom could conceivably be placed in the top flight of Bolshevik leaders. Only with the entrenchment of the bureaucracy and the construction of a party hierarchy controlled from above did the post of General Secretary become all important. It is impossible to trace exactly the changes in the social composition of the party since 1930. Since that year, the practice of publishing such information has ceased. The omission is in itself highly significant. Nevertheless, it is possible to gain some indication of the social composition of the party from the education level of the members. In Russia, only 1 in 20 children finishes secondary school, not to speak of the university. Yet of the 1,588,852 party members in 1939, 127,000 have received a university education, compared with only 9,000 in 1934 and 8,396 in 1927, and 335,000 had received a secondary education, compared with only 110,000 in 1934 and 84,111 in 1927. At the 1924 Party Congress, 6.5% of the voting delegates have received a university education. At the 1930 Congress, 7.2%. In 1934, about 10%. In 1939, 31.5%. And at the 1941 Party Congress, 41.8%. The percentage of delegates who had received a secondary education were, in 1924, 17.9%, in 1930, 15.7%, in 1934, about 31%, in 1939, 22.5%, and in 1941, 29.1%, including those with an incomplete university education. Thus, adding the two together, the proportion of delegates who could be classified as belonging to the, quote, Soviet intelligentsia, end quote, was in 1924 24.4%, and in 1930 22.9%, in 1939 54%, and in 1941 70.9%. At the 1939 Congress, when 41% of voting delegates have received secondary and higher education, only 9.3% were industrial and agricultural workers. The percentage must have been far smaller in 1939 and 1941. As regards the Komsomol, its secretary, N.A. Mikhailov, stated, quote, at the present time, more than half the secretaries of provincial, territorial, and central committees of the Union Republics have a higher or incomplete higher education. The remaining secretaries have a secondary education. Amongst the secretaries of the district committees of the Komsomol, 67% have a secondary or higher education, end quote. N.A. Mikhailov. Nikolai Mikhailov lived from 1906 to 1982 and was a Soviet politician, journalist, diplomat, Komsomol, and Communist Party official. Komsomol was the all-union Leninist Young Communist League, usually known as Komsomol, was a political youth organization in the Soviet Union. It is sometimes described as the youth division of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, although it was officially independent and referred to as the, quote, helper in reserve of the CPSU, end quote. The Komsomol, in its earliest form, was established in urban areas in 1918. During the early years, the Komsomol was a Russian organization known as the Russian Young Communist League, or RKSM. During 1922, with the unification of the USSR, the Komsomol was reformed into an all-union agency, the youth division of the all-union Communist Party. Komsomol was the final stage of 3 youth organizations with members up to age 28, graduated at 14 from the Young Pioneers and at 9 from the Little Octoberists. Back to the text. Moreover, the manual workers at party congresses, a considerable number were Stakhanovites. During the war, when the number of party members increased from 2.5 million to 6 million, 47% of all the candidates accepted had received a high school or university education. On the 1st of January 1947, of 6 million members and candidates, 400,000 had had a university education, 1,300,000 had completed a course at high school, and 1,500,000 had an incomplete university education. Local information on the social status of new entrants to the party shows the same trend. For example, during 1941 and the first 2 months of 1942, in the province of Chelyabinsk, of those admitted to probationary membership, 600 were workers, 189 kolkhoz members, 2,035, quote, white-collar workers, end quote. Of those who completed their term of probation during that period and became full members, 909 were workers, 399 kolkhoz members, and 3,515, quote, white-collar workers, end quote. Thus, more than 70% of new candidates and new members were of the latter category. In 1923, only 29% of the factory directors were in the party. In 1925, the partial victory of Stalin's faction, 73.7% of the members of the managing boards of trusts, 81.5% of those on the boards of syndicates, 95% of the directors of large enterprises were party members. By 1927, the corresponding figures were 75.1%, 82.9%, and 96.9%. In 1936, between 97.5 and 99.1% of this type of personnel belonged to the party, and the figure for the chiefs of trust was 100%. As for Red Army commanders, whereas in 1920 only 10.5% belonged to the party, the figure had reached 30.6% in 1924 and 51.1% in 1929, and if we include those belonging to the Komsomol, it had soared to 71.8% by 1933. Today there is no doubt that they all belong. If we consider that in 1937 managerial personnel numbered 1,751,000 and that at least 9/10 of these belonged to the party, it is obvious that relatively few people outside this class could possibly have belonged, for the total number of party members and candidates was only about 2.5 million. There's no exact figure available for 1937, but the figures for 1934 and 1939 were 2,807,000 and 2,477,000. This conjecture is borne out by examples such as that of the Presnya machine building factory in Moscow. Of the 1,300 employees in that factory, members of the party numbered 119, of whom more than 100 were salaried employees and only about a dozen were manual workers. These proportions would no doubt be similar in most other factories. Parallel with the change in the social composition of the party membership came the elimination of the old guard of the party. Of the 1,588,852 members on the 1st of March 1939, only 1.3% had belonged since the 1917 revolution, and 8.3% since 1920, that is, since the end of the Civil War. At the end of the 18th Party Congress, it was in fact emphasized that 70% of the party members had joined only since 1929. On the eve of the February Revolution, the party had 23,600 members. In August 1917, 200,000, and in March 1921, 730,000. It is therefore obvious that only about one-fourth of the 1917 members and about one-sixth of the 1920 members were still in the party in 1939. This large-scale disappearance of the old guard cannot be explained by natural causes because the great majority of the party members in 1917 and 1920 were very young. Even in 1927, 53.8% of the party members were below 29 years of age. 32% were between 30 and 39, 11.4% were between 40 and 49, and only 2.8% were older than 50. A few additional facts will suffice to show how far Stalin went in the physical liquidation of the old leaders of the Bolshevik Party. The first political bureau of the 10th of October 1917, it did not yet bear that name, consisted of Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Sokolnikov, Bubnov, and Stalin. In 1918, Bukharin was added. In 1920, Preobrazhensky and Serebryakov were added, but a year later they were replaced by Zinoviev and Tomsky. In 1923, Rykov took Bukharin's place. Throughout the Civil War, the Bureau was composed of Lenin, Trotsky, Kamenev, Bukharin, and Stalin. Of all these leading figures, only two, Lenin and Stalin, have died a natural death. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Rykov, Serebryakov were executed, each after a show trial. Trotsky was murdered in Mexico by a GPU agent. Tomsky committed suicide on the eve of his arrest, and after Tomsky's death was denigrated as a, quote, enemy of the people, end quote, and a, quote, fascist, end quote. Sokolnikov was condemned to a long term of imprisonment, and Preobrazhensky and Bubnov disappeared during the, quote, Great Purge, end quote. In the document known as his testament, Lenin singles out 6 people for particular mention. Of these 6, 4 were shot by Stalin's order after a, quote, trial, end quote. These were Pyatakov, Bukharin. Of these 2, Lenin wrote, quote, in my opinion, the most able forces among the youngest, end quote, Zinoviev and Kamenev. Trotsky was murdered. The only one of the 6 whom Lenin spoke scathingly was the executioner. Of the other 5. Of the 15 members of the first Bolshevik government ever to be organized, the Council of People's Commissars of October 1917, only one, Stalin, survived the, quote, purge. 4 members died a natural death: Lenin, Nagin, Skvortsov, Stefanov, and Lunacharsky. The other 10, Trotsky, Rykov, Shliapnikov, Krylenko, Dybenko, Antonov, Ovsenko, Lomov, Opakov, Milyutin, Glebov, Avliov, and Teodorovich were either executed by Stalin's orders or died in Stalin's prisons. All the highest officials of the various commissariats have been, quote, purged, end quote, repeatedly. Thus, for instance, one commissar of labor after another has been removed and then executed or held in prison. The first to hold this position was Shliapnikov, and then V. Smirnov, later Mikhail Ulganov, and finally V.V. Schmidt. I'm not going to look up all these people. I can't. That would just take forever. Among those purged as, quote, fascist dogs, end quote, Trotsky had been so prominent in the party that both during and after the Civil War, the party was called the, quote, Party of Lenin-Trotsky, end quote, and the government was similarly known. Rykov had replaced Lenin after his death as chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, or roughly premier. Zinoviev was chairman of the Presidium of the Executive Committee, or president, of the Communist International, and Tomsky was the president of the Trade Union Congress. Others purged included army chiefs. One deputy commissar of defense, Emin Tukhachevsky, was executed, and another, Jan Gamarnik, committed suicide when faced with arrest. According to an official pronouncement, another, Marshal Egorov, quote, disappeared, end quote, a little later, and so did the commissar of the Navy, Smirnov. Of the 15 commanders of armies appointed in 1935, only one continued to enjoy his high position after the purges. One had died a natural death, but all others had been branded as, quote, traitors and, quote, purged. Nearly all the ambassadors of the USSR were also, quote, purged, as were two-thirds of the political police. Yagoda, who had himself prepared the Zinoviev Kamenev frame-up, and Yazov, who prepared the other, later trials, in one of which Yagoda became a defendant. If all those liquidated by Stalin had really been, quote, fascist and, quote, traitors, it's a complete mystery how they, comprising as they did at least 9/10 of the leadership of the party and the state throughout the October Revolution and the Civil War, came to lead a socialist revolution. Thus, by their sheer magnitude, the, quote, purges, end quote, proved their sham nature. To add a grim touch of mockery to the tragedy of the, quote, purges, Stalin placed the responsibility for their enormous extent upon their first victims, the Trotskyites, who, Stalin claimed, wished thereby, quote, artificially to sow discontent and bitterness, end quote. And thus, quote, the Trotskyite double-dealer can artfully hook, the embittered comrades and skillfully drag them into the bog of Trotskyite wrecking, end quote. Zhdanov, in a speech to the 18th Party Congress, rounded out his fantastic allegation with a claim that by extending the, quote, purge, end quote, the Trotskyites had aimed to, quote, destroy the party apparatus, end quote. By the same logic, the Inquisition could have accused their victims of responsibility for the auto de fe. Auto de fe was the ritual of public penance carried out between the 15th and 19th century of commanded heretics and apostates imposed by the Spanish, Portuguese, or Mexican Inquisitions as punishment and enforcement by civil authorities. Its most extreme form was death by burning. Back to the text. The following incident cited by Zhdanov in the same speech indicates with cruel irony the scope of the, quote, purge, end quote. Zhdanov said, quote, certain party members have resorted to the aid of medical institutions in the effort to ensure themselves, bracket, from being, quote, purged, end quote, and bracket. Here is a medical certificate issued to one of these citizens, quote, owing to his state of health and mind, comrade so-and-so is not fit to be used as a tool by any class enemy. District Psychiatrist, October District, City of Kiev, signature, end quote, end quote. Final section. Withering away of state and law. Marx postulated that with the establishment of socialism and the abolition of social classes, the state would cease to exist. The absence of conflicts between classes or other social groups would make superfluous any permanent apparatus of coercion in the form of army, police, and prisoners. Law, too, would cease to exist, since, quote, law is nothing without an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of law, end quote. Under socialism, all conflicts would be between individuals. For the suppression of such individual wrongdoing as would continue to manifest itself after the abolition of poverty, the chief cause of, quote, crime, end quote, in present-day society, no special repressive organization will be needed. The, quote, general will, end quote, to use Rousseau's terms, would prevail and deal with such problems. As Stalin once said long ago in 1927, quote, socialist society, bracket, is a society without classes, society without a state, end quote, Stalin. These ideas found expression in the Constitution of the RSFSR, issued on the 10th of July, 1918. It stated, quote, the fundamental object of the Constitution of the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic, a constitution designed to serve the present-day period of transition, is the establishment in the form of a strong all-Russian Soviet authority of the dictatorship of the urban and rural proletariat together with the peasant poor, to secure the complete suppression of the bourgeoisie, the abolition of the exploitation of man by man, and the realization of socialism, under which neither class divisions nor state authority will no longer exist, end quote. Notice the word there, socialism. After the victory of Stalin, however, the line changed entirely. Stalinist spokesmen have stopped speaking of the, quote, withering away of the state, end quote, and indeed have gone quite the other extreme, claiming that, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, and even, quote, communism in one country, end quote, goes hand in hand with the strengthening of the state. Thus, P.F. Yudin wrote in 1948. Quote, the Soviet state is the main force, the main instrument of the construction of socialism and the realization of the construction of communist society, end quote. Again, quote, the consolidation of the Soviet state by every means has been the necessary condition for the building of socialism and now of communism. This is equally one of the most important laws of the development of Soviet society, end quote. Yudin. It says that Pavel Yudin was a Soviet philosopher and Communist Party official specializing in the fields of culture and sociology and later a diplomat. He lived from 1899 to 1968. Another Soviet theoretician said, quote, communism presupposes the existence of a perfect apparatus administering the economy and culture. The apparatus develops gradually and finds its form in the condition of the transition from socialism to communism. ... That is why the rise of communism will be in accordance with the degree of perfectibility of our state and economic apparatus, end quote. The strengthening of the Russian state, its increasing totalitarianism, can only be the result of profound class antagonisms and not of the victory of socialism. That's the end of Chapter 2 of State Capitalism in Russia by Tony Cliff.